Welcome to the Motorcycles Are Drugs podcast, a show where we speak with artists and engineers, connoisseurs and problem solvers from the moto world and beyond. I'm Henri Boulanger.
And I'm Gary Boulanger.
We're a father-son team that has collaborated for years through storytelling and imagery, often combining our creativity with the adventure and community we've found on two-wheeled machines. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Today's guest is Jared Zaugg, who pioneered a new approach to promoting motorcycles as art in 2006. He and his wife, Brooke, created the Legend of the Motorcycle annual event, launched as the first world-class concours d'elegance exclusively for motorcycles. They attracted an international audience of collectors, judges, and aficionados to the Ritz-Carlton overlooking the Pacific Ocean in Half Moon Bay, California.
All of these machines were created by human hands. So the machines, regardless of the performance, it's all about humanity. The people that designed them, the people that built them, the people that raced them, the people that bought them. It all comes down to people. It's not just cold metal, it's people. This is Jared Zaugg, and you are listening to the Motorcycles Are Drugs podcast.
So, Jared, the deep radio voice you've been talking to, that's actually Henri. I haven't really said a word yet. So this is my youngest. He's 28 in a couple of months.
Oh, wow.
We share a lot in common. He's kind of living the life I wish I would have led, but I got married young, had kids young.
Good for you.
And so I'm living vicariously through him, so to speak.
It's not vicarious, you're participating.
I'm participating.
Nice.
I love that you're working with your son.
The wonderful thing is, when he decided to get into motorcycling when he was 17, it got me back into it. And so there's a lot of things that he was raised on, whether it was watching on any Sunday, The Great Escape, you name it, that influenced him, that got me back into things.
Very cool.
So how old are your kids?
I've got 3 boys. So my wife and I specialize in boys, evidently. And they're all teenagers. I have one that just turned 19. I've got one that's 16, and I've got one that's 13. So they're all 3 years apart, and they're good boys. There's only one teenager that I've come this close to shoving down the stairs, but otherwise, they're good boys. They're really good boys. I can't complain too much at all. And I think it'd be a dream to work with my kids. So you working with your son, I think is wonderful. Especially if you guys can make it work. That's healthy. I think I've worked with family before. I've really enjoyed it. And I think it's every parent's dream to be able to interact with their adult kids in some way. So I love that idea.
You and your dad, when you were younger, you went on some pretty cool adventures. How was that just as a kid, seeing all that? How involved were you with what he was doing?
You know, it really informed my life, and it's difficult. I don't, when people say, where are you from? It's a difficult answer. When people say, what do you do? It's a difficult answer, which it shouldn't be, because most people are from a spot and most people have a profession. So when I was a kid, I grew up all over. Spent the first 4 years of my life in Panama, the country of Panama. Then spent 4 years in Colorado. Then spent less than 2 years in West Africa. And then spent about 10 years in Idaho. So we were always kind of in remote places. And so as an American, I'm very much a product of the West, of the Rocky Mountain West. But then I went on to, I lived in Spain for a couple of years. Growing up in Idaho, there are a lot of Basques. I mean, if anybody reads Hemingway or knows about Idaho, there's a strange connection to Spain in Idaho. And you wouldn't expect it, but there is, and it's really fascinating. But I spent a couple of years in Spain, and then I married a girl from San Francisco, I married young like you, Gary, and I don't regret it whatsoever. I knew she was the one and never looked back. And then I lived in California, specifically San Francisco, for 12 or 13 years. We had our 3 boys there and then moved out here to Utah. And I've been in Utah for about a decade. And I love being in Utah. People might ask, why didn't you end up in Idaho where my family stayed, or maybe in Colorado where I spent some time as a kid? But Utah has a lot going for it. But to answer your question, my dad, without getting into too many details, he's a veterinarian, but there are 3 types of veterinarians, to keep it very simple. Those that specialize in small animals like cats and dogs and pets and so forth. Those that specialize in large animals like horses and cows and livestock. And then those that specialize in exotic animals like for the zoos and so forth. So my dad is qualified in all 3. And then on top of that, he's an entomologist, which means he studies insects. And that's a really uncommon combination because most of the diseases animals, especially wildlife, get are from insects. And so that's why he was in Panama. That's why we were in West Africa. And that's why we went to Idaho. So he worked a lot with, in Idaho with the Fish and Game Department with, again, I don't want to bore anybody here. I know we're here to talk about machines and bikes and cars, which I love, but I do love the outdoors because of my dad. So he's focused on brucellosis in bison and how does that work with cattle and elk, or how sheep grazing in the mountains with the Basques in Idaho, how that can transmit diseases to the bighorn sheep. So always had a lot of adventures with my dad, spent a lot of time outside, fishing, hunting, exploring, and I love the outdoors. And I'm trying to pass that on to my boys. And I enjoy being in Utah for that reason. And just to circle back with my wife, she's born and raised in San Francisco. She's a city girl. We're a classic example of country mouse meeting a city mouse. And so while Salt Lake City isn't most people's idea of metropolitan, I mean, it's a nice little city and it's got some good things. And in fact, it's got a lot of good things and it's a great place to raise a family. And it's also extremely accessible. So if you were to live, say, in Boise or Bozeman, you always have to connect if you want to go somewhere. Salt Lake has direct flights to everywhere. Everywhere, including Europe. So, and it's, in my opinion, a lot better lifestyle, more affordable, but healthier, a lot more accessible to the mountains than, say, Denver. So anyway, just to bring it all together, we're in Utah. My wife's happy. I'm happy and never expected to be in Utah, but I'm really glad to call it home. And that's kind of where I grew up. Like I said, it's not a straightforward answer, but with my dad, went on a lot of adventures, and he's the one that got me into classic cars. And then we can talk later about how I got into classic bikes.
Well, that's actually probably a perfect segue into it. When did you get into all those things? The motorcycles, was it cars first? Just break that down for us.
Yeah, it was cars first. My dad, he's an interesting paradox. So he's kind of this old cowboy. And he's really tall. He's 6'4", wears cowboy boots. I always say he's 6'4" naked. So he's a real tall, lean guy, but then he wears cowboy boots. So what does that make him? 6'6", and then he'll wear a cowboy hat that makes him 6'8". God. So he's this really tall guy. And then my mom's this midget. She comes up to his ribs, and she's this feisty little firecracker. And I think that's why I'm just normal size, because my mom's so small, she's petite, my dad's so tall. So they're an interesting couple. But the reason I bring that up is because you would think that my dad, kind of being this old cowboy from the West who loves to work with wildlife and so forth, or who's got his, hands in some tiger at the Boise Zoo or whatever it may be, or helping with bison in Yellowstone, you'd think that if he were into any kind of cars, it might be some muscle cars or some Americana or some old Corvettes or, I don't know, an old Cord or who knows what, right? But my dad is into old British cars. And I've always loved that paradox because in Idaho, we don't live on a farm. It's not a ranch. It's it's kind of a combination. So we've got acreage in a barn, and he's got horses and some dogs and some cats that live in the barn and keep the mice away. So it's kind of a farm style atmosphere, but not necessarily a farm. And it's not big enough to be a ranch, but that's kind of the idea of where they live. And yet in his barn, he's got all these old British cars. He's got 4 Daimlers. So I say Daimler. I don't say Daimler. It's not Daimler Benz. It's Daimlers, the British Daimlers. The ones that the company that was the purveyors to the royal family before, long before Rolls-Royce, and then the Daimler that got bought by Jaguar. And really nobody knows about Daimler. They don't even hold their value well, which is interesting because they were really good handmade cars. And my dad's into Daimlers. So we have these 4 different Daimlers, all, of course, right-hand drive. And he keeps them in his barn in Idaho, and he takes them out in the spring, and he drives them all spring and summer, and especially in the fall. Falls up in the Rockies are gorgeous, as you guys know. And he definitely stands out like a sore thumb with his cowboy boots and cowboy hat, and driving these right-handed drive. Some of them are roadsters, and some of them are hard tops. And then he bought my mom a little Morris Minor Woody, which is perfect for her because she's so tiny, and the Morris Minor is tiny, but it's a Woody. And my mom is very much a gardener. She spends all summer out in her garden. And so she's always touring around town to nurseries and so forth and farmers markets in her little right-hand drive stick shift Morris Minor Woody. And my parents are colorful, and I love that about them. And you just wouldn't expect they live in a little town in western Idaho. So about a half hour west of Boise, closer to the Oregon border, in this little town. And like most towns in the West, little towns that are agricultural, you have all the guys driving big Ford and Dodge trucks and whatnot. And my dad's got his big Dodge truck to haul his horses and his hay and whatnot. But he's also got all these old British cars. And so they really are anomalies. But that's where I got my love of vintage vehicles, was from my dad, for sure. And my mom, when my mom was in college, she drove a Sunbeam Alpine, and my dad drove an MG I mean, this was back in the 60s. So they've been into British cars their whole lives, which is interesting because their parents sure weren't. But that's where I got my love of vintage motoring, was from my parents, no doubt.
Very cool. We know you have a penchant for Land Rovers and for travel, and that seems to have its own sort of cult following. It seems like people fall deeply in love with that particular brand, and it gets wrapped up in these very romantic, faraway places.
Totally.
Can you talk a little bit about you and Land Rovers?
Yeah, I'll talk about Land Rovers, and then I'll talk about how I got into bikes. So talking about classic British vehicles, when we lived in West Africa, we had 2 vehicles. We had a Land Rover Series 3, and we had a Land Cruiser FJ50. And this was early 80s. I think it was 1980, 1981. And if anybody knows vintage Land Cruisers, the FJ50 is just a fabulous vehicle. I mean, talk about an SUV before that whole concept. I mean, Jeep invented the concept of the SUV, the Wagoneer, right? And Range Rover perfected it. I mean, there's no argument there. Range Rover brought SUV into the luxury and just perfected it. But Toyota, wow. I mean, everybody knows what the Japanese do. Don't necessarily invent anything, but they take what people have done and they just make it ideal. And so I always love to joke that when we had to go out into the bush or we had to go out far, my dad would not choose the Land Rover Series 3. He would choose the Toyota because he didn't want to be stranded in the middle of absolute nowhere. Plus the Toyota, the suspension was amazing. And it was just superior in every way. But the Land Rover, they just have so much character. They're just undeniably adorable in so many ways. And yeah, it's a love-hate relationship because they leak oil. I mean, what British vehicle doesn't leak oil? You know that's a sign of authenticity. I mean, if there is not an oil puddle under your BSA or your Triumph or whatever, or your Land Rover or your Daimler or your Sunbeam, then you've got a problem, right?
Probably forgot to put oil in it, right?
Right. That's it. There you go. There's your problem. But there's just something undeniable about the character of Land Rovers. And I have always loved Land Rovers, I think, from my childhood in West Africa. And so, what was it? Maybe a couple years before COVID, I decided that I would create a kind of a get together for Land Rover enthusiasts. And I call it Trans Terrace, which means across lands, Latin for across lands. And did it in Southern California. Why did I do it there? Because I didn't know how many people would show up. And the largest concentration of classic Land Rovers in one area is Southern California. And so it just made sense. So kind of put the word out there. And my wife helped me. My wife and I, she's brilliant. We've always been partners in everything that we do. But we had, trying to think of the numbers here, but we had for just this first get together, Trans Terrace. We had it up at the old movie set up there, just east of Malibu, that burnt down in the fire. In fact, we had it about 6 weeks before that huge fire hit and burnt it to the ground. But it's where they filmed Westworld, and they filmed a lot of old movies and so forth.
Oh yeah, the big old town, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I thought that was a cool contrast to have British Land Rovers kind of invade the Old West. But we had 60 to 70 Rovers of all different types, mostly series. But we had some classic Discoveries. We had some classic Range Rovers. And it was a lot of fun. And people really enjoyed it. And so the next year we had to get together, and we had it down at the motoring club down there in, I'm having a mind blank. They're in the LA area, right there by the marina. And that was a fun turnout too. It was easier for people to get to. As a matter of fact, going back to the first one, we had up in the hills, up at the old movie set, I was driving a friend's Defender 110, and it broke down on the freeway. It broke down on the freeway about 2 exits before my destination, and had to have that towed to the shop. And I thought, well, that's an authentic experience. Leaving me stranded on the 101. Then COVID happened, and we have not had Trans Terrace for a couple of years. And I'm working on planning that for the fall. We always try to do it in the fall. It's always been around the end of October, beginning of November. And we'll probably have it in Southern California again. I'm not exactly sure the location. We've been talking about maybe doing a camp out on Pismo Beach before. There's a lot of talk about that getting closed down or being highly restricted as far as vehicles driving on there. Vehicles, that's the one state park in California. Well, actually, there are 2. There's one up by Crescent City, and then there's Pismo, where vehicles can drive on the beach. You can camp on the beach with your vehicles and so forth. But there's a lot of talk about that possibly going away, which is, well, I've got my opinions on that, and I'm really quite disappointed. Don't know if I need to go into that. But so we are thinking about maybe having a camp out for our third Trans Terrace up at Pismo Beach at the end of October, beginning of November. Just need to figure out dates and so forth. But Land Rovers, yeah. Who can deny the appeal of a Land Rover? Like I said, it's a love-hate relationship, but that's kind of the fun of it. In fact, I have a good friend I like to quote, not with Land Rovers, but with bikes. And he says he loves Italian bikes, vintage Italian bikes. And he says, I hate BMW. I don't. So I'm just throwing this out there. But he says, I hate BMWs. And I said, why? He says, because they're too reliable. And I remember just laughing my head off. I'm like, what does that mean? He said, if you're going to be into a vintage bike, you need to be able, it's like he says, he said, it's got to have a temperament that you need to be able to understand and to be able to finesse and to be able to not necessarily control, but manage. I mean, that's He loves vintage bikes. He loves Italian vintage bikes because they are temperamental, because when they're running well, they will give you so much pleasure and power and passion. And then sometimes very passionately, they decide to just quit on you and take a siesta.
Very animalistic.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's his argument as to why he'll never own a BMW, because they're too reliable. But anyway, going back to Land Rovers, some people like that. I'm a horrible mechanic, but I realize that if I'm driving a Land Rover, that's the risk I take, and I'm prepared to take that risk. Like breaking down in the Defender 110 on the 101 in rush hour traffic, and people honking at me, even though because it's California, even though I've got my hazards on, and I'm trying to get my vehicle onto the shoulder, I've got people honking at me as if I'm trying to pull some kind of stunt. But anyway, it's all part of the experience.
Well, Jared, going back to the old reliable BMW, I noticed the other day you posted something about professing your love for your wife on, I think it was an R75.
Yeah, it was a 60/5. It was a 1972 60/5 toaster tank. And I remember the exact day I got into bikes. I was living at home. So I was, I don't know, 16, 15. I was an impressionable young teenager. I already loved vintage automobiles because my dad and my mom. And I have an older brother who's 4 years older than me. And he was Mr. Cool. He looked like James Dean. He had the hair. He was fit. He wore the t-shirts. This was the 80s. He was into punk rock. He introduced me to all the great punk rock bands, British and Southern California punk rock bands. And I idolized him. And I remember I was outside doing some chores, and he had borrowed somebody's motorcycle. I think it was just kind of some put together crappy little Honda. But me being 15 years old, or however old I was, and my brother pulling up on his buddy's Honda, of course, no helmet, just sunglasses, t-shirt, Levi's. He might have been wearing combat boots because he was Mr. Clash. He thought he was Joe Strummer. But he pulled up on this motorcycle, and I just thought, my brother is the coolest dude in the world. He's like, hey, you want to go for a ride? And I was just hooked. And that was it. And I knew I didn't want a modern bike. I knew I needed a vintage bike. Because of my parents, I love vintage, but it was bikes because of my brother. That was rock and roll, specifically punk rock. And I was sold. So fast forward to your question. I'm in college. I had a job in San Francisco because I was in love with this girl who would soon become my wife. But I got a job out in the Bay Area so that I could be near this hot girl from San Francisco. And it was the end of summer, and I needed to get back to college. And I remember taking a wad of cash that I had earned, and there was this classic BMW for sale. And I have no shame in admitting I'm a crappy mechanic. And I haven't done much to change that. So that's 100% on me. I make no excuses. But I saw this ad, went to go see the motorcycle, loved it. It ran, good enough for me, paid the guy the money, literally got on the motorcycle, went and bought helmet and goggles. All my gear, I was a college student, all my gear fit into a duffel bag. Got some bungee cords, put it on the back. And within 1 hour of buying a vintage BMW from a guy that I'd never met before, I headed up to Idaho within an hour of buying it. And, now as an adult, I would think that's stupid. But you know what? That was the greatest thing I ever did. I had no fear, because when you're younger like that, you don't really think about consequences. You don't really care. You feel like you've got all the time in the world. I had no money, but I had all the time in the world. So if I broke down, I'd figure it out somehow, right? And if one of my kids did that, I probably would get pretty upset. But I remember getting on buying that bike, giving the guy the money, getting the title, going up the block, buying a helmet and some goggles, and I was on my way. Just took off, crossed the Sierras, crossed the Great Basin of Nevada, went up to Idaho, spent some time with my parents, And then got on it, drove across Idaho, drove down through Utah. Anyway, I drove across the West on this thing and I loved it. And my then girlfriend, now my wife, we went to the same university. So I used that to take her on dates. And that was it. I didn't have a car. I mean, I did my grocery shopping on that. It was tough in the winter. And when there was, serious snow and whatnot, I'd borrow a roommate's car, but that was my primary vehicle. And I loved that thing. It was gorgeous. And also had a vintage car, not at the same time. I couldn't afford to do that. But when I was at college, I had a 1966 Cadillac Sedan DeVille. And I have to tell you guys the story behind that. So we're switching back between cars and bikes. I hope we're not zigzagging too much.
Of course. No, the flow is amazing.
The Cadillac sounds like the size of a small house, correct?
Oh, it was. So get this. This was a year before. And I got a job in working for a pest control company knocking doors. Like, who would ever do that today? But this was in the 90s. And they said, hey, sign up and you can get a ton of money and pay for college or whatever you want. And so I thought, yeah, all right. So I went and I signed up and they said, you're going to be knocking doors all summer long selling pest control. And you can either go to Phoenix, Arizona, Memphis, Tennessee, and then there was another one, I don't remember where, like Raleigh, North Carolina, or I don't remember. And I just thought, I have never been east of the Mississippi except to airports. And I love music. I don't know a lot about music, but I love music. And I love blues. I love blues rock. And I thought, I'm going to go to Memphis. I'm going to go to the home of the blues. Actually, the home of rock and roll, you've got the $1 Million Quartet, you got Sun Studios, and then of course you've got all the guys that influenced all those guys in the $1 Million Quartet. Elvis and Johnny and Jerry Lee Lewis and all those guys. Who were they influenced by? They were all influenced by B.B. King and Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters and all those guys. But Memphis was the place. Memphis is the home of the blues, and then I would argue it's the home of rock and roll. The beginnings of it. So I signed up for Memphis, Tennessee. I didn't know anyone there, never been there, didn't matter. So I go to Memphis, Tennessee, and I knock doors every bloody day in 95-degree heat with 95% humidity. But I loved it because it was totally new and it was the South. And I'd never experienced the South. And I love the South. Cliches exist because there's always an amount of truth in a cliche, whether it's positive or negative. And the people in the South, they are hospitable, they are kind, they are polite. And I'd never experienced, people in the West are open and warm and nice. But the South was different and I loved it. And nobody would want you to knock on doors now. Everyone's got door cameras. Somebody knocks on my door, I ignore it. Nobody would dare knock on anyone's door today, Even when somebody needs a signature like Amazon, I was the door knocker. Now I'm like, who the hell's knocking? Who's knocking on my door? Who has the nerve to knock on my door? Because if it's a friend, they text you or call you, hey, I'm going to swing by. Most Amazon guys just toss stuff on your doorstep. When you need a signature, I actually get angry. Anyway.
Well, were you emblazoned with a uniform of the pest control company?
I had a little shirt with the logo on there. And then I think we could wear whatever. They made us wear khaki shorts. And we could wear whatever shoes we wanted. And I would wear Vans, but they don't have any arch support. So that's kind of funny because I remember going to, I hope I don't want to offend anyone here. I remember going to one of those walk shops where they sell those walking shoes for like elderly folks, that are like, have all of this. This is the 90s. This is before there was 1 trillion choices in shoes. So you could buy like dress shoes, or you could buy some Nikes or Adidas, or you could buy some Vans or some Converse. But I went to this walk shop that only catered to elderly people. And I remember because I was on my feet from 9 a.m. till 6 p.m. I bought those pair of shoes that the elderly folks wear with all the padding and arch support.
Were they taupe or light charcoal?
Totally. How do you know? Well, you own a pair.
No,
Gary,
I used to work at Foot Locker 30 some years ago. So we're talking about sensible shoes, not old people's shoes, by the way.
Well, that makes sense too, right? There's always that period before technology sort of hits the mainstream where
Yep.
the demographic that absolutely needs that technology, they're like, all right, I guess we'll make shoes good for your feet so that these people can walk. And then everyone else goes, actually, we'd love a pair too if those can come in a different color, please.
Mm-hmm.
So they were taupe. And I love that you knew that they were some awful color. They were taupe. Anyway, I had these massive walking shoes and supports for this and that for elderly folks, but they were comfortable and they allowed me to stand on my feet all day. So I'm walking around Memphis all summer long, knocking on people's doors. People were actually very polite. People did say, hey, why don't you sit on the porch with me and have some iced tea? Or even the older fellers like, hey, I won't tell anybody. You want a sip of whiskey here? I got some of my own whiskey here. I got some moonshine I made. But people were very nice. And I'm knocking doors all summer long. I come across this house, and in the carport is this old Cadillac. And the lady who answers the door is an old lady. She's not interested in pest control, but I asked her about the Cadillac, and she said, that was my husband's. He was a preacher, and he died so many years ago. And she said, I don't get out much, and it works, but I only drive it to the grocery store and to church on Sundays. And I loved it so much, and she showed it to me. I asked her if she'd be willing to sell it, and she said yes. She said, I'm probably too old to drive now. And she says, every time I look at it, it makes me think of my husband who passed away, and it kind of makes me sad. I kid you not, that car had 14,000 original miles on it. That's it. 14,000 original miles. The entire thing was original in every way. The tires, the floor mats, they had only driven it to church and the grocery store. That's it. Even in the back of the trunk, they had the original cardboard liner that when you got a new car, now you get plastic that covers a sheet of plastic that covers everything. And back in those days, you had the full-size spare tire and the tool kit, and then the vinyl that covered everything. But then you had this cardboard insert that kind of kept it all from falling out of place just for the showroom. That was still in there. I mean, it was time warp. And the other thing, too, I didn't realize, because I was raised around vintage British cars, I had no idea how advanced Cadillac was. This was in 1966, and it had power windows. Okay, no big deal. It had power antenna. It had power seats. It had power everything. And you might say, well, luxury cars in the 60s had that. Okay, well, it also had, in addition to cruise control, it had censored brights, meaning you turn on the brights, but when another car is coming down the road, those brights automatically go back to low. Censored. 1966.
I don't even have that now.
Right? Right? And then it had climate control. Not air conditioning, climate control. 1966, you would put it on a Fahrenheit number. You didn't put it on high, low, or whatever. You put it on a Fahrenheit number. I mean, it was unbelievable. And so I ended up learning a lot about Cadillac because I was fascinated by it. And so long before Mercedes-Benz and long before BMW and long before Rolls-Royce, it is absolutely amazing the technology that American cars invented, particularly Cadillac. So it's actually kind of a sad decline when you see how far Cadillac has fallen in the market. Because when you think of a luxury car today, you definitely don't think of a Cadillac. You immediately think European, specifically German. You might even think Japanese now because they're so good. But anyway, I had this 1966 Cadillac Sedan DeVille that was a time warp. I loved that. I had that for a year, drove that back to college and from Tennessee. And I sold that so I could fund a trip to go back to West Africa. I took a semester off, went back to West Africa and traveled on my own. And those were some serious adventures. And we can talk about that more later if you like, but to connect the dots, a year forward, a year after that, that's when I had my BMW motorcycle. That's what I used to impress the chicks and woo my wife. And loved that bike. That was a great bike. Ended up selling that too. I mean, I think all of us had to sell whatever we had because of obligations, tuition, getting married, kids, whatever the case may be. And everybody's got their sob story of, oh, I should have kept that. I should have kept this. But I mean, that's just life. And I wish I'd kept a lot of things, but at the same time, I'm just so glad I got to have them. So to the BMW, the 60/5 toaster tank, loved it. It was such a great machine. Such a great machine.
Now, what if, going back to what you said about your friend, the one who's all about the passionate Italian bikes.
Yeah.
What if you would have followed suit? You would have been able to make it to Idaho. You wouldn't have been able to make it, throughout the winter. You would have been able to impress your now wife because you would have been able to make it to her door.
Probably.
Something to be said for that, right?
Yeah.
I was just on the phone with JP Defoe, who said to say, hey.
He's a cool guy.
He was regaling me with stories of why /5s and /2s matter compared to Velocets and old Triumphs and so forth. So it's, our community is far and wide. What did you study in school, and how did you transition into being this moto journalist and event planner and gadfly that brings together so many people from so many corners of the world?
So that's also a fun discussion, and that's even more complicated than if you were to ask me where you're from. So I am hopelessly curious. I'm a very curious person, and I have a lot of interests. And the reason I say it like that is because most friends I have, most guys, they have a couple of interests. I'll just make a generalization here. They love cars and they love football, for example. And so they do their day job, and then they watch football or they work on cars or whatever. And that's great. And that's healthy. And that usually makes them pretty good at what they do. It makes them pretty good at being a mechanic and fixing cars. My problem is I have so many interests that I can get distracted easily. And I would probably say it doesn't ever make me an expert at one thing because I'm always interested in you too, huh?
Same, very much same. I was like, oh, he's just describing my journey as well.
Well, I don't see that as bad, but I admit I'll probably never become an expert in one thing because I'm not dedicating myself to my one thing. So I admire guys who are experts in what they do. I mean, whether you are a sculptor or a welder or, we're talking about, I guess, mechanical things here, or just my neighbor up the street who can put anything together. I mean, he just put together this old Alpha that nobody could figure out the transmission. He took it to every transmission shop in the Salt Lake area. And you're like, well, Salt Lake's not Southern California. It's amazing the talent that's here in Utah because all of California has moved to Utah. But I say that because none of the guys anywhere in this valley could figure out the transmission issue. He's just like, screw it. I'll figure it out. And he did. And I'm like, I'm impressed. But that's because he loves to tinker. He's good at what he does. So back to your question. In school, I studied business and international relations, and I also minored in biology. I minored in biology, I think, because of the father I had. I love the natural world. I love to be outside. I love adventure travel. I love to fish. I love to hunt. I don't do much of that. I tried to take my boys fishing a lot when they were young. I still get out and hike a lot. I don't camp as much as I ought to, but I love the natural world. And so I got a minor in biology, but I majored in international relations, which is business and I guess you could say diplomacy. And what did I do with that? Well, this is where I'll need to explain kind of what I did in order to answer your question, Gary, because I've zigzagged a lot. I have my fingers in a lot of pies. When like one of my kids' friends will say, hey, what do you do? I say I'm an entrepreneur. And that's true. And that's the easiest way to say it. And, most people are able to say, oh, I'm a doctor. I'm a lawyer. I got an auto body shop. I don't have an answer like that because I do so many things. So when I graduated, my wife and I got into advertising. And my wife and I ended up running an advertising agency in San Francisco for about a dozen years. I really enjoyed that. We had a variety of clients, particularly clients that are specific to the Bay Area. So that'd be tech, hospitality, travel and leisure, even some professional sports teams, even wine. And I liked understanding and learning about all of those different industries. And to transition to bikes, this is an interesting segue. I living in San Francisco with my wife. Before we had kids, we had time on our hands. And anyone who's a parent knows exactly what I'm talking about. You can't imagine, you look back and you think, geez, I had so much time before I had kids.
Sorry, Dad.
That's fine.
It is so true. It's like, wow, so many hours in the day. It was fabulous. I loved going to Pebble Beach. My dad took me to Pebble Beach, Concours d'Elegance, see the cars and so forth. And I always assumed somewhere in the world, something like Pebble Beach existed for bikes. And the more I looked into it, the more I found out that there wasn't. And I thought, well, there's still got Europe something. There wasn't.
What era, what year that you started thinking about this? Where are the bikes?
Mid-2000s. And I realized there is no Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance for motorcycles. There were some events that included motorcycles. I won't say which because they were kind of the ugly stepchild. They were kind of off in the corner. They were kind of ornamental or a consolation. There was never a focus on bikes. And I just told my wife, I was like, I'm going to create a Pebble Beach for bikes. And surprisingly, she said, go for it. I'll help you. And then I told other people and they're like, yeah, that'll never work. And then I'd go to, being in the advertising industry, I'd go to certain brands and they'd say like, yeah, no one's going to support that. Or if I talk to somebody who's supportive, they're like, all right, yeah, well, what you need to do is you need to contact Coors or Pabst Blue Ribbon or Marble. I thought, no, that is just, when we talk about bikes, this is old now. And so it's not a big deal. But back then in the mid 2000s, a bike event was Sturgis. And Sturgis is a blast. I've been there once, rode out there. I don't need to go again, but that's me.
Same.
Yeah.
We rode out in 2018 and you're right. It was an experience. It was a hoot, a lot to see, a lot to do. But I think, thinking, oh, I want the Pebble Beach for motorcycles and someone going, oh, well, there's always Sturgis.
Yeah.
Misses the point. It's a different thing entirely.
Yeah. So, you go to Sturgis, you have a blast. It's beers, bikes and babes and bros. You have a good time. But I wanted a Pebble Beach for bikes. And I remember, and I want to give some credit where credit is due. I just thought, all right, first, I do need the support of the motorcycle industry, and then we'll go from there. And if I can get support for the motorcycle industry, then I think we've got something. I contacted Ducati, and they didn't know me. I mean, I didn't have any contacts in the motorcycle world. And Ducati said, yeah, we'd support something like that. And I thought, that's it. That's it. We have something now. And so it was a whirlwind. What I did, because I wanted to elevate motorcycles on the same level as automobiles, I'm talking about collectors' motorcycles, I went to the non-expected brands. So we got support from the motorcycle industry. There were actually, and I won't name them, a lot of motorcycle companies would not support us. They wanted to participate. They're like that little nursery rhyme where they don't want to help make the bread, but when that bread is baked, they're all there with their hands ready to have a slice of hot bread or whatever that Mother Goose tale is. But there were a couple motorcycle companies, Ducati being one of them, that said, yeah, we'll support you. Triumph was another. So I went to brands like Range Rover, Riva Boats, Cartier watches, Moet and Chandon, and they supported us. And they made it happen. Cohiba cigars. And my wife and I wanted a venue, so we got the Ritz-Carlton in its golf course on the ocean in Half Moon Bay, which is mind-blowing. We needed a dramatic setting. And talk about dramatic setting. It's maybe a little too windy. Pebble Beach is kind of protected or sheltered, so you don't ever really get, at least in August, you don't get fierce winds and so forth. We did ours. We decided to do ours at the beginning of the season, the first weekend in May, because we thought this might get guys from all the other different states who have cabin fever, the guys in New York and Minnesota and Iowa, to drive out because they've been cooped up in winter all long. So we chose the first week in May, also because it didn't conflict with the busy summer schedules. I wanted car guys there. Of course it was for bikes, but I wanted people who were into automotive to be there, and I wanted it a place where they would bring their wives. Talked to a lot of bike guys, and they're like, yeah, my wife doesn't come to this swap meet with me or to Sturgis or that, and I don't mind because I'm with my friends, but it'd be nice sometimes for my wife to come. Well, the wives aren't necessarily interested in that to make a huge blanket generalization. I wanted a place where the wives are going to be just as happy. And so it's a beautiful place. There's good food. If you can afford to stay in the Ritz, you're going to love that. If you can't, that's fine, but you're in Half Moon Bay, which is a beautiful little town. Even if you stayed in a little mom and pop motel, it's beautiful. So that's where we chose. And we had no idea what the first one was going to be like, and it was a massive success. I was very, very pleased. We worked our brains out. It took us a year and a half to prepare for it. The first one was in 2006, and then we had one in 2007 and 2008. We would have featured marks as a draw. So the first one, we had Bruff Superior and Crocker. And again, a lot of bike guys did not know about those marks or those brands. And I'm very pleased to say that we had the most Bruff Superiors ever gathered in one place at one time in history, and the same with Crockers. We had, it's been a while, and so the numbers may be wrong, but we had well over 30 Crockers, and we had, I believe it was 40 or 50 Bruffs.
Oh my God.
And most guys coming had never seen those before. I mean, I feel like, and that was before social media. I feel like now everybody's so informed, which is a good thing. But in the mid 2000s, there was really no social media. And so people weren't really sharing. And so of course the internet existed, but we had celebrities come, Ewan McGregor rode up, Peter Fonda rode up. We had fabulous group of industry heroes like Giacomo Agostini was there, and Mert Lawwill, and we had so many people there. Plus the salt of the earth, the guys like you and me, the regular guys, the guys who can't afford to own a Bruff Superior, but they brought their best Triumph Bonneville or their best Harley Sportster, which is really the bread and butter, which is, if you don't have that, you don't have an industry. You don't have a hobby. You don't have, those are the true enthusiasts. And we had collectors from around the world. Guys from Australia came, guys from Europe came, guys from Canada, all across the United States. And it was incredible. And I attribute that. Yes, my wife and I worked our brains out, and we chose, I think we made some good choice. We chose a beautiful venue, and guys did bring their wives out, and the wives loved it. And I kid you not, you're out there looking at hundreds of beautiful motorcycles from all eras, as early as the late 1800s. And there's a whale going by, and spouting, and you're like, this couldn't be better, So it was wonderful. We had, I wanted it to be a seriously judged event. That was also a very new concept. Yes, you had the Antique Motorcycle Club of America and their judging criteria. I felt that it could be done differently. I know that sounds a little bit arrogant. I don't mean that in any boastful way whatsoever. But what I did was, because I wanted to mirror this after Pebble Beach, I contacted the chief judge of Pebble Beach. And come to find out, he's a big motorcycle enthusiast. So in his garage, he's got Ferraris, but he's also got Harleys, and that's his thing. And he loves to ride. And so I invited him to lunch. And his name is Ed Gilbertson. And I really need to salute him and congratulate him, because here I am, some 20-something-year-old kid with no contacts in the bike world, never done anything like this before. And I call him up and I said, hey, you don't know me, and I don't even know if we have any friends in common, but I'd like to pick your brain and take you to lunch and tell you what I'm doing. He said, okay. I mean, now that we're adults and we're all busy, I don't know if some kid called me out of the blue and said, hey, I'd make him time. I don't know what I'd do.
Your pest control door-to-door salesman pedigree brought you to that moment. You know that, right?
Right.
It all comes back around.
So Ed Gilbertson, who is was the chief judge of the Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance for decades and developed the judging criteria for my event, which we called the Legend of the Motorcycle. So it was a very seriously judged event. And so we got judges from around the world to come and participate, people that knew their stuff. And some of them were very well known. Some of them were just experts in their field. Some of them were former racers because we had competition classes. But I also didn't want it to be too esoteric or too limiting. I didn't want it to be too stuffy. I wanted to give due to custom bikes because really what's motorcycling all about? It's about freedom. It's about doing whatever the hell you want to do. That's what motorcycling is all about. And the car world, Pebble Beach, can be too stuffy or too rigid or too, I'll leave it at that. I wanted guys to come who ride bikes because bikes allow them freedom. And so what does that mean? That means having a class for customs. And again, that's not a big deal now. That was new back then. I wanted to have classes for racing, classes for classic bikes, and so forth. And I wanted the bullet bike guys to come. I didn't want just the vintage guys to come. I wanted the guys who are on those race rockets and are always talking about how much, you got way too much tread on your tires, or you didn't scuff your knee enough around that turn. I wanted those guys to come. I wanted the MotoGP guys to come and rub shoulders with, not necessarily Hell's Angels, but that is what is so, and that is the takeaway. What you saw there was the greatest cross section of life ever, because you have all the MotoGP dudes coming on their Japanese bikes in all of their leathers. They look like they're walking on the moon. And then you have all the old guys with limps because they've crashed and broken their legs how many times doing flat track or whatever. And you did get some Hell's Angels, and you did get some super rich dudes who had the bruffs. And you got the legends, the racers, some celebrities, and just the regular guy next door who's wearing his cleanest t-shirt. And I loved it. And I loved that some of the younger guys learned a lot about old bikes, and some of the old bike dudes got some respect for the new bike guys, and it was a very positive thing. We did it for 3 years, and it really did change the face of motorcycling. It changed the way people view motorcycles and the way people collect motorcycles. Now, a negative would be that it increased the prices of a lot of bikes, and that's true. When we had our event, Crockers, if you knew what one was, sold for, less than $100,000, and the reason I know that is because after my event, there was a guy who called me up and he said, hey, I'm about to cross the Golden Gate Bridge. I've got this Crocker that I'm taking down to my place in Pasadena. There's a guy who thinks he wants to buy it, but you and I are friends. And I know you love Crockers, Jared, and I'll sell this bike to you for $100,000. And I remember thinking, that's a good price. And I'd sure love one, but I don't have $100,000. And I don't even know if I could get on a decent payment plan. I mean, this would be a 30-year payment plan type of thing. So I said, thank you for calling me. He says, well, I'm going to be driving by your house. I said, thank you for calling me. I got to pass. Well, what's a Crocker going for now? 750,000, 800,000, So yes, I guess a critique would be that my event gave so much exposure to certain bikes and increased the price. And yeah, that's tough for people, but didn't price everybody out of vintage bikes. There are so many vintage bikes at every level. So that I feel that the positives were many, the negatives were few. We did it for 3 years. Why did we stop? Because the world meltdown, 2009. We had sponsors that said, look, we were committed for the Olympics. We can't even do that. I mean, 2009, the world is seriously melting down economically all over. And so my wife and I looked at each other and we said, because it took us almost all year to prepare for a weekend event. And we said, well, we have a few sponsors, so we can either do this halfway or we can do it all the way, but we're not going to have any money to do it all the way. And we just thought, you know what? We really feel like we have created a standard here. People are traveling from all over the world and they expect a standard. And the motorcycle community is pretty forgiving. And if we had said, look, guys, especially now that we've gone through 2009 economic hell, and now that we've gone through COVID, people are forgiving. Motorcycle guys are forgiving, especially. If we had sent an email out to everybody and said, there's no money to be had, so we're going to have it in a parking lot, people would have come. But my wife and I just thought, we set out to create the Pebble Beach of motorcycles, and we did. And it was reported around the world in the Financial Times of London, in Playboy, Forbes, Fortune, LA Times, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, everywhere. And we just thought, we're either going to do this right or we're not going to do it at all. So we said, you guys, we sent out an email to everyone saying 2009 is not going to happen because of the world economic meltdown. And then 2010, it didn't any better. And then 2011, things were kind of rebounding, but by then, I don't know, the world had just turned, and we didn't do it anymore. And so that we kind of just laid it to rest, and others have tried to pick it up where it left off. There have been some notable events. They don't have the serious judging, which I feel is important. Why? Not because I'm a stickler. I mean, I was just talking to a guy. A friend of mine, I want to buy his Indian. And he was like, well, look, it doesn't have the right carburetor, this, or it doesn't have, or this is a little different. This isn't for the rider. I was like, this is a rider. I don't want to enter this into a show. But the reason I was a stickler about judging criteria for the show is because that is for history and posterity. If you have a bike that's not correct, I don't care because you ride it. That's what's important to me. In fact, part of our judging criteria is I wanted, and we gave extra points for people who rode their bikes there as opposed to trailer them. Now I know that you say, well, that's not unfair if a guy's coming from Florida. True. But all things even, if the guy from Florida's bike and the guy from Southern California's bike are in a deadlock for points, we're going to defer to the guy who rode it up from San Diego because he rode it. And bikes, they're machines. They're meant to be used. Anyway, back to the judging. That's important because it gives you a reference for history. History is important. Understanding the history of bikes, understanding why they were made, how they were made, what they were supposed to be when they came out from the manufacturer. That's important. So there are some events that take place today. They don't do serious judging, and so I see that as a negative. But then again, they still bring people together, and that's what it's all about. So that's a positive. The other thing our event did was Pebble Beach held their first motorcycle class, and they announced that it was in honor of what we did. And they only did that for a few years, and they don't have it anymore. And then Villa d'Este in Italy did the same thing. They decided to hold a motorcycle class in honor of our event. So I feel very satisfied that we did what we set out to do, which was put bikes, give them a larger consciousness, put them on the same level as cars. And Pebble Beach and Villa d'Este, that's proof of that. And so even though we don't have our event any longer, my wife and I are really proud of what it accomplished, what it did. I'll give you a moment to say something. I
Definitely.
realize I'm talking here a long time.
No, it's fantastic. And I especially love hearing about that because obviously I've been fascinated with motorcycles. My dad rode motorcycles when I was younger. But as I became a rider, that was sort of in that period of like 2006 to 2013, where you're getting into middle school, high school, you're thinking about the future. And what a crazy time in general. That's like a 2006 to 2013 time span. A lot was changing, right? And even as recently as 2006, there wasn't a major event to showcase the artistry, the community, to bring all that together. Like you said, it's this almost paradigm shift of awareness and information where it's true nowadays, there aren't many pockets that are still complete unknowns or communities that have been, untapped. For better and for worse, there's, with the internet, so much that's available just to look at. But I think there is still a lot to be said for something tangible, an event. And it's just a weekend, but in a world where there's infinite images and words and articles and everything else, and that's fantastic.
Yes.
But there are only so many events that you go to and face to face with people. It is the social side of it.
It is. That's it. It's human connections,
Mm-hmm.
and it brings us all together. And like I said, you've got the bullet bike guy talking to the old grizzled guy who's on some kind of American iron, and they've got common ground for the first time.
Yeah.
And or you've got some young guys saying, "Man, I didn't know they clinch your tires," or they had overhead valves all the way back then, or it's an info dump, and people are talking, and it's camaraderie, and people are coming together. These little genres of motorcycling that almost never intersect. How often do the Vespa dudes hang out with the chopper dudes?
Mm-hmm.
Never. But here they did, and they're talking, and they're interacting, and they're having a drink together, and they're kicking tires together. And we had the new manufacturers or the manufacturers unveiling new concept bikes or their latest reveal or whatever it was. I mean, it was a lot of fun. It was definitely a lot of fun. It was it all comes back to what you just said. It was about bringing people together more than anything. It was that human connection.
Yeah, and that, just to sort of wrap up the legends portion of this, that's why you kind of hinted at the difference between the car and the motorcycle world, and we don't need to necessarily compare the two all that harshly, but something I think we get a lot out of the motorcycle side of it is tangible. It is this very visceral experience, and it's accessible. There's all these different brands and entry points, and the barrier to entry is not that high. And you can go all the way up to the Crockers and the Broffs and everything else, but you have all these different worlds. And so something in person like that, I mean, how many times have you looked at a bike that you think you know everything about, but you've never seen it in person? And then you realize there's lines to it, or there's, oh my gosh, the way they connected these parts, I didn't realize that it looked like that. And then there's someone standing there, you got any questions? And they have this, gleam in their eye. So it is very, very cool to get that opportunity to see those things and to make it real.
I have a good friend who's a rider who, as a result of your organization of the event, Jared, he was at Alice's restaurant with some friends. They had ridden up there. Can't remember which year it was, but they said they heard this loud noise. This old bike comes pulling up. It's a gaggle of older guys, and one of them specifically is wearing these leathers, and they were kind of mocking him because he looked like a poser. Who does that guy think he is? Giacomo Agostini? Hardy har har, plump 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 up the wooden staircase. It's Giacomo Agostini. I so wish I would have been part of that scene back then, because, as you know, at Alice's restaurant here in the Bay Area, it's about motorcycles and cars and camaraderie and all that. But it's one of those things, if you wait around long enough, or if you put yourself out there enough, you're going to have these interactions, and it's pretty common occurrence. I know the Rock store down in Southern California is another one, right? So it's really interesting how the ripple effect of what you guys did really brought a lot of joy to the Bay Area motorcycle scene.
Thank you.
So the personalities like Giacomo, the characters, the true characters. I mean, the guy's 80 and he was just at an event in New York City with Team Obsolete, proudly putting on the leathers, firing up the MV, I think this time. That brings a lot of joy to a lot of people of all ages. But speaking of another character, tell us a bit about Alain de Cadenet. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. You must have some incredible stories. Talk about a man of many skills and abilities that seemed, much like you, always curious.
I love what both of you said, not to beat a dead horse, but to emphasize. I think you said it better than I did. All of these machines were created by human hands. So the machines, regardless of the performance, it's all about humanity. The people that designed them, the people that built them, the people that raced them, the people that bought them. It all comes down to people. It's not just cold metal, it's people. Every single thing about motorcycles really comes back down to warm flesh and blood people. And you both emphasize that. And I like, if there's ever a takeaway as to motorcycles or cars, that's what it is. It's really about people. It's really about people. That's what it comes down to. And then with people, there's stories. So Alain de Cadenet, he is, or was, he passed away in this past summer. An Englishman with a French name that lived in California. And fabulous guy. He was a bon vivant. He had a silver tongue. He could charm the pants off just about any woman. He could make just about the most hardened, grizzled guy pee his pants with laughter. He always was full of stories, and he was incredibly suave and debonair. And I mean, he's like some kind of Errol Flynn guy out of a movie, but he could put his money where his mouth is. He and I became friends. There was a huge age gap, but just kindred spirits. I love the guy. So he was raised in Great Britain. His father was French, had a French name. He chose to live in between London and Los Angeles, but Los Angeles was his primary home. So he spent most of his time in California. He came to fame, if you look into him, through Le Mans. What he did, and he loves to tell this story, but he was a photographer. He was really into photography when he was young. And he was a photographer for Rolling Stone. And he would go photograph all the rock stars and go to all their parties and this and that. But it was a friend of his who raced cars and wasn't very successful, who said, if you really want to get the girls, or as he would call them, the birds, if you really want to get the birds, racing is where it's at. And he said, no, he says, I'm pretty sure it's photography, hanging around with the rock stars. He's like, no, he says, who gets all the girls? It's the rock stars. It's not the hangers on. It's not the managers. It's not the photographers. It's not the roadies. It's the rock stars who get all the girls. If you want to get girls, and he says, that's all I was interested in at that time. I was in my early 20s. He said, his friend told him, it's racing. So he went to a couple of races and he saw how the girls just gravitated to the racers. And he said, that was it. I wanted to become a race car driver. I didn't know anything about it, but that's what I wanted to do. And that's a story. How much truth there is to that, I don't know, but I'm sure there's a grain of truth in it. But what is true is he ended up being the only person in history to build his own car for Le Mans. Build his own car, not just go get sponsored and buy and get a Ferrari or get a Lotus or whatever. He built his own car, and he called it a de Cadenet. He entered it in Le Mans, and he won a podium placement. The only person in history to build his own car and win a podium placement. That was Alain de Cadenet.
Wow.
The man, yeah. Right? Amazing. He's competing against everyone, Jaguar. I mean, all Ferrari, all of the manufacturers he was there competing against. Speaking of Ferrari, this also talks a little about his mindset and character. He loved racing so much that it was all about performance. And he actually owned 3 Ferrari GTOs in period. And 3, right? The
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I can't. There is a notable silence because I think both Henri and I are doing the math. What's the
100
value?
million. They're worth about 100 million. They're worth about $100 million. You might be able to find one for $75 million, but nonetheless, he owned three of them, and I remember asking him, "Well, why?" And he said, "Well, because they were last year's model. Like, so Ferrari would race them for a few years, and then they would develop something bigger and better. So what he would do is he would go to Ferrari and buy their used cars, and then he would try and tune them up because that's all he could afford. I mean, he was a one-man band. He was out there knocking on doors trying to get some sausage maker to sponsor him, or a candy bar, or whatever, right? And so he got used Ferrari GTOs. He did well with them. He ended up owning three of them. He never kept any of them, and he would race them into the ground. I mean, he said, I had no idea that they would become worth tens of millions of dollars. I remember it was about 10 years ago. Bonham sold one and broke all world records by selling it for, I don't know what it was, 30, $40 million, but now they're worth 80 million up to $100 million, depending. I mean, it's insane. But Alan had those cars because he raced them. And his nickname was the Alpha Man because that was his thing. He was into alphas, and he was specifically into pre-war alphas. And he loved alphas. He loved fixing alphas. He loved working on cars, and that was his passion. He was the Alpha Man. He was not only into cars, specifically performance cars, specifically Italian performance cars, but he was into bikes. He loved bikes. And he was always into Vincent's, and he rode Vincent's. And he famously crashed on a ride at our event on his Vincent Black Shadow. And this is a funny story. He was wearing a shot Perfecto that was Marlon Brando's. And you're going to think, well, how did he get Marlon Brando's leather jacket? Well, Alan's mother went on a date with Marlon Brando, and it was cold that night. So Marlon lent his jacket to Alan's mother and told her to keep it. And then fast forward, who knows how many years, she has Alan, and she's like, here, take this leather jacket. It's a men's leather jacket. And, oh, where'd you get it, Mom? Oh, one night on a date with Marlon Brando. So Alan would ride it around. Most of us would just I don't know, I would frame it and put it on the wall. Alan rode it around. That was his bike jacket. So when he crashed his Black Shadow, which was just a twisted heap of metal, because he crashed really hard up there on Skyline Drive, not far from Alice's, hit a huge pothole. Of course, racing. It was supposed to be a group ride, but he can't just stay with the pack. He's always got to push it and see who's going to. I think
we all know those types. Yeah.
Was it Paul? Yeah. I think it was Paul Dorleon on his Sunbeam. And Paul's old pre-war Sunbeam is what, it's 250 or 350, but that squirrely thing is fast around corners. And so Alan's on this huge Black Shadow, but of course those two start getting a little bit ahead of the pack, and then someone's wheels a little bit further. Next thing you know, it's just all out. But he hit this huge pothole, crashed very badly, mangled the Black Shadow. When the paramedics arrive, he doesn't care that he could be paralyzed for life or that his Black Shadow is destroyed. He was begging the paramedics not to cut Marlon Brando's jacket off his body. He's like, please, just unzip it, please. And they're like, sir, you look like you could be paralyzed. We're going to do what's easiest for your life. And so they cut it off, and he could never get it repaired. But he's like, damn, they ruined Marlon Brando's jacket.
God. It could have been where none of the paramedics were old enough to remember who Marlon Brando was, so it went over their heads, right?
Maybe so.
Well, and talk about that value of something, because you kind of hinted at, if I had that, you're so tempted to put it behind glass, and I can think of any number of objects that have nowhere near that value or importance. But even if it's just something nostalgic, you think, oh, maybe I won't bring that out, or maybe I won't wear that or use it, or because what if it gets. But It's so inspirational hearing about somebody who just goes, it's a jacket, I'm going to wear it.
Yeah.
It was probably horsehide too, so it's really good for riding, right? It did its job. It protected him. He just wasn't able to protect the jacket from the paramedics.
Well, that was the great thing about Alan, is if it was made for a purpose, he used it. And people could say, Well, he could certainly afford to because he was a very wealthy guy. So yeah, he could afford to have a Ferrari GTO and drive it into the ground, or take Marlon Brando's jacket and wear it, or ride his Vincent Black Shadow as if it was his daily cruiser. But you know what? That's what they were made to do. And yeah, someone like me, I don't have the wherewithal to, maybe be so offhanded about that. And I would be more protective because for me, it'd be a big investment. For Alan, he used it for what they were made. And I think there is a lot to be said about that, whatever it was. And after our event, of which he was the master of ceremonies, he was unfamiliar with Crockers. He owned some Bruffs. He owned several Vincents. For bikes, he was into British bikes. For cars, he was into Italian. But he was very unfamiliar with Crocker and absolutely fell in love with Crocker and ended up owning, I believe, three. At least three, but again, he would ride those. He would ride them all over LA. He'd go to the grocery store or whatever. I mean, people had no idea what they were looking at in the parking lot. People had no idea the value of it. He couldn't care less. I mean, he would ride things as they were intended to be used. And so there was a lot to say about him. And, in addition to bikes, he's into airplanes, and he flew a biplane. And he flew a Piper Club, and he was the triumvirate. He was into cars, bikes, planes. I mean, if it had an engine and it offered excitement and adventure, he was into it. He was definitely a Renaissance man.
So you called him the alpha man. He really sounds like the alpha male, for lack of a better cliche.
Yes, but not in your face type of alpha man. Like when we say he's an alpha, he wasn't overbearing. He wasn't in your face. He wasn't trying to outdo anybody. So it might have been a play on words. It might have been a double entendre, him calling himself being called Alpha Man, but it was anyone that knew him knew it was because of Alfa Romeo. In fact, he was a judge for the Alfa Romeo class at Pebble Beach because, I mean, that was his thing. He wasn't just a collector or a pretty boy who loved pretty things. I mean, he knew his stuff. He definitely knew his stuff.
Sounds like someone I think we would have enjoyed their presence quite a bit.
Well, and especially guys like that and anybody like that, I think there are a lot of sort of tropes or stereotypes that get wrapped up in it, but it's always worth remembering that you can be tough and not toxic. You can be, you can be super capable and not rub it in people's faces or somehow turn that into like a holier than thou stance. Like,
yeah, look at me.
You can be capable. And I love that when someone embodies that. And I don't think I've met more people that fit that description than I have in the motorcycle industry. Like it's full of people who are so giving and so kind. And also they are everything that, everyone kind of talks about.
And he did. And he was always generous with his time. And another thing that was really cool was when Herb Harris sold the John Edgar Rolly-free Black Lightning, the one flat out of Bonneville, probably the most famous motorcycle in the world, sold it to Chip Connor for, I think, about $1 million. Chip Connor is a car guy, lives in Hong Kong, a billionaire, well known in the car world. Chip bought that bike, and then I'm trying to think of as a PBS Discovery, I don't know what, but they wanted to do something about that bike, and so Chip Connor had the bike shipped to the Bonneville Salt Flats, and then specifically had Alan de Cadney ride it. So Alan was 10 years ago. So the guy was in his early 60s, and he was as fit as a fiddle and looked great. And so to look the part, he put on some sneakers and a pair of swim trunks, tight swim trunks, like the Speedos with a little bit of leg to them or whatever Rolly wore. And he got, riding a Black Lightning is like trying to hold on to wild horses. I mean, all of us think we would love to have a Black Lightning. I mean, who wouldn't, right? But to ride such a thing, it's like they're almost uncontrollable. And the Rolly free Black Lightning, that John Edgar had Rolly free ride back in the day to a world record, didn't even have a seat. So Alan is in his early 60s, naked practically, laying on it for the TV movie, and he's not He's not going nearly whatever the speed was, 100 and whatever it was, but he's still going a good 70, 80 miles per hour on his stomach in the middle of the summer on the salt flats on the first black lightning in the world. It's amazing.
That is fantastic. We've talked a lot about the past and vintage machines and all this rich history. We're also at a really interesting and very exciting point, kind of looking to the future. There's a lot of changes. You've got e-bikes and different technology, different uncertainty. Something that has existed for over a century is all of a sudden getting this massive sort of existential. We're just at this point, right? So as somebody who is very into these machines from the past, what does the future look like to you? Where do you think we're headed? What do you think is going to work? How are we going to find that balance?
That's a good question. It's always an important question. I pause because I want. Short answer is, of course, none of us know. What's my thought? What's my supposition? What's my guess? I think we're going to do just fine. We're going to evolve. I am an optimistic person, but I do see a decline in motorcycling coming if it's not already in progress. And that sounds like Chicken Little, the sky is falling. I don't want it to sound like that. I think we peaked at motorcycling because it was affordable for so many after World War II, and it's affordable in developing countries. And then it became a lifestyle choice for so many of us here in America. When you go to a developing country, it's not a lifestyle choice; it's a necessity. You know, they're riding these lower displacement bikes, whether that's India or Vietnam or wherever that may be. It's not a choice for them; it's a need. So for most of us guys in the Western world, it's a choice. I know the motorcycle industry has some real ebbs and flows. So I'm not negative on it, but there's just so many. I never thought I would live to see, autonomous driving cars. That still freaks me out. I was talking to one of our mutual friends, Pete Young, who took an Uber in an autonomous car in San Francisco. He'd been out at a bar, was drinking. I'll call a taxi or whatever. He got a car with nobody in it. I said, well, that's kind of freaky. And he said, it's actually kind of nice, It's interesting to think about. So to your question, where do I think we're going? Electric motorcycles. I love the idea, especially for dirt bikes. There is so much now thought given to the environment, and rightly so. I mean, people can take it way too far and become zealots and so forth. I live in Utah, where there's a ton of off-road riding, and a lot of people that have moved here from out of state are trying to close that down. It's always going to be a give and take. But I love the idea of electric specifically for that reason, because it is considerate of others. We're always going to have concerns like, you don't want to get out in the middle of nowhere and be stuck because your battery's dead or this or that, but we're figuring that out. I don't even want to talk about the sustainability. Electric isn't the answer because we can't even recycle the batteries and we still need petroleum products to create them. Don't even want to get into that. We have to start somewhere, and it's not ideal, but we're starting that and we're on our way. So I like the idea of electric bikes. I personally am not sure that I would own an electric street bike yet. I'll give you a perfect reason. When I go to LA is insane to get around. Everybody knows that. You can't get anywhere and in under an hour. And if you want to get anywhere in LA, you need a motorcycle or a helicopter. Well, I don't have a helicopter. And the great thing about the motorcycle is you can lane split in California. And so when I go to LA, I usually borrow a bike from friends, and that's how I get around. And the last time I was on a bike in LA was a couple of years ago. And I was on a friend's old Triumph. And I swear I was almost killed in one day several times because everyone in LA is distracted. Everyone's on their phone. Everyone's putting on their makeup or doing this or doing that, or nobody's looking at the road in LA because there's so much stop and go. Like if you were just constantly driving, you're paying attention, but because you're stopping so much, you're doing other things. And I was almost killed so many times. And if it weren't for the loud pipes on that old Triumph, I know I would have been run over or hit. And so, from my personal experience, from my personal point of view, my personal opinion, I don't see myself getting an electric bike for the road, for the street, uh, anytime soon, unless I can figure out a way I can become more safe. But I'm all for getting an electric dirt bike. I mean, that sounds great. The future isn't just electric. You ask what the future of bikes is. I think electric is going to play a big part of it. What about that girl, that lady who rode across Africa recently, completed her trip on a cake bike, on one of those electric cakes? I mean, talk about an adventurous person. What a woman. Some young lady doing anything across Africa, even if it's in a brand new rally car. I mean, I've lived and traveled in Africa. I mean, it can be nuts. You're putting your life in your hands in so many different ways. Here's this young lady solo riding an electric bike across Africa. Man, kudos to her. So the future is well on its way with regard to electric. As far as the adoption of motorcycles, I don't see it being as being as popular as maybe it was for Gary and me. I just don't see as many younger people coming into it. And I mean, I just turned 50. I mean, I'm not even that old, but I don't see a lot of 20-year-olds into bikes. It felt like there was a time there when maybe a few years ago, there was a lot of 20 and 30-year-olds getting into the choppers and stuff, which was really cool. But guys younger than them, like my kids' friends in high school, I don't see them into bikes. So that's not negative. That's not pessimist. It's just an observation I'm making. And I don't know. I guess that's my thoughts on the future of bikes. I hope it continues to evolve. I love progress. I'm not stuck in the past. My sweet spot may be vintage bikes, but when I need to get to point A to point B and it's far and long and in between, and it could be remote, I'm going to get on something modern, and I love that. So I'm not stuck in one place, but I suppose those are my views.
It's funny you talk about the cake adventure across Africa, and it just made me realize, we're about 100 years beyond the point where there were, the first person to take a motorcycle around the world, right? So a burgeoning technology and people doing what they always do, which is, let's see how fast we can do this. Let's see if we can compete. Let's see how far we can go, because that is powerful. That story of, oh, they took it across Africa. In one sentence, you can speak to the efficacy of a new technology or the courage of somebody using that technology. And then people go, oh, well, if they can do that, I suppose I could take that thing to the grocery store. And that's probably what's going to drive this next generation. If somebody can figure out a way to tell that story, especially in the US, it's really built for cars. It's really built for these other things. But if you can find a way to tell that story and get people excited again, I don't know what that is, but it's that human element.
You hit another good point. I like your comments. How did the Baja 1000 start? Honda wanted to prove itself to an American market that was skeptical of Japanese goods. They get Dave Eakins. He gets on a Honda. He rides down the entire length of Baja in a short amount of time, totally successful. Boom. What does that do to Honda's credibility? And then all of a sudden it turns into this competition, the Baja 1000. Look at this young lady, like you just said, on cake. What does that do to cake? Immediately, overnight. Cake always had a good reputation, but geez, if someone can take a cake bike, I mean, those aren't known for being gnarly or, like aggressive. I mean, usually you're thinking of some huge Germanic, KTM, BMW, or something, that you need a step ladder to get your leg across to ride across Africa. She's on a cake bike. Overnight, well, not overnight for her, but once she crossed that finish line, overnight, the credibility for cake and electric bikes, boom, huge. You're totally right.
Well, this has been fantastic. It's been really good talking to you. We love the story. We love when it flows. Sometimes people, they say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting off topic, or I've been taking up a lot of time with this or the other thing. We love seeing where it goes. And this has been really good, getting to know you, getting to hear your story. And yeah, talking about the past and the future and all of it. I'm stoked. I'm going to go on a ride right after this.
Right on. Right on. Very cool.
One of the things I enjoyed talking to Jared was going into it with the research. We didn't know a whole lot about him because he doesn't really share a whole lot out there in the public sphere.
Usually he's the one interviewing or showcasing or otherwise facilitating other people's stories.
That's right.
Yeah. He's a really cool guy. I think the main things I was struck by, he was sort of built in with this sense of adventure from a young age, got to see all these amazing things, go these places and grow this sense of confidence and worldliness. And everything he's done has sort of carried that over, whether it's seeing something he wanted to see in the world and then kind of going, well, I guess I'll be the one to do it, and having all these skills he had built up and just making it happen and kind of using that positive, adventurous spirit that we got to share a slice of while we were talking to him to just make stuff happen. Really cool guy.
I hope we can see him this summer when we make our way east on the bikes.
That'd be really cool.
Motorcycles or Drugs is produced in the San Francisco Bay Area. Stay tuned for a season of interviews and additional bonus episodes. You can find us online at motorcyclesordrugs.com.